But here's the key. We grow in distress. You go to the gym, you work out, you lift weights, you put your muscles under distress, and they grow, right? You want to change your dietary system, your body is not functioning with food well, then you take a fast, and in that moment you struggle, but the body reconfigures itself and we grow. So the concept I say to all human beings watching, the idea of getting to know each other, even though it's a little bit more uncomfortable than what you're accustomed to, causes growth. Hello, and welcome to Robert Young's Bright, Famed, Shining, the podcast, where creativity meets wellness. Today, I say this at the beginning of every podcast. Oh, today's an extra special, but today's an extra special day. We've got a gentleman with us today that was one of the key individuals. I won't say people, but so much more than that. One of the key influencers in me deciding to move to Washington, D.C. in the heart of the pandemic. When I met this gentleman, we didn't know what was coming, but a few weeks later, it came. And meeting him was one of the key reasons, one of the main reasons why I felt this out of the blue moving to Washington, D.C. was the best idea for me. So as we move forward, I just want to give a bit of background. This gentleman, as understanding of these great United States of America, is a little bit more in depth than some of us because he happens to be the president and CEO of Destination DC. If you don't understand exactly what that means, if you're thinking about tourism and you're thinking about business and you're thinking about being a visitor to Washington, D.C., doing business in D.C., in fact, doing business in the United States, this is a gentleman that has every bit of nuanced information you could ever imagine to make your decision. In the podcast with us today, we have Mr. Elliott Ferguson. It is absolutely a pleasure to have you here, sir.
Good morning, and Robert, it's a pleasure to be here. You give me way too much credit, but I'm looking forward to spending some time talking to you a little bit more about what I do and going from there.
You have a memory of when we first met.
I do for the most part. I mean, I think that one, your background, your personal background, Caribbean background and mine, was something that really tied us or connected us together. But I think as you were looking at and focusing on all the things you were doing creatively in Miami, and talking to me about what's happening in Washington, I don't remember the finite details of when we met, but I remember the conversation and talking about, Washington as a city, my relationship to Miami. My dad's from the Bahamas, so as you know, I always joke that the Bahamas is a suburb of Miami. So a lot of my family are in South Florida, and that was kind of the beginning of the connection in terms of all the amazing things you've done in your career and perhaps how some of those things could actually manifest here in Washington.
Yeah. So firstly, thank you for that. And I will tell you that my experience was very unique with you. I had been in Miami for years, doing projects in Miami for years. And the connection in terms of government-funded agencies or the government itself has always been a bit skewy. I can't explain exactly why, except for which is odd because when I first got to Miami, I was appointed to the Arts and Entertainment Council to advise the mayor on decisions regarding art and culture in the city, which is very weird. But years later, it was always a weird connection. And it was someone in Miami. I had just done Art Basel and had wrapped the Historic Lyric Theater. And it wasn't exactly, it was artistically an incredible experience, but professionally not so great. And someone, however, through that mix said, there's someone you need to meet. You got to meet this gentleman in DC. And I think I messaged you on LinkedIn, of all places. And I was always amazed with, firstly, how fast you responded and how open you were to having a meeting with this stranger. And that, to me, let me know it felt home. It felt comfortable. Because oftentimes a person in your position, someone's messaging you and you don't know them, there's a want. And for me, the only thing I had was I had something to give, and I wanted to know the right people to talk to see whether DC is the place that I could give that thing. It was the first time in all my years in the US. Of course, I was born in Canada to Jamaican parents, so there's our Caribbean roots. And as you know, I spent most of my time living in Los Angeles or in Miami. So there's our connection once again. And of course, Bahamas is in the building. But what happened to me when I walked in that building and our meeting was a warmth I had never felt in any stranger meeting, business meeting ever before. It was very, very, I felt very appreciated that I was making the effort, and I felt like I walked away with a lot of information, of a whole lot of information that who knew that 2 weeks later that the 9994 proclamation would come out on Friday the 13th of March, and 2 days later, I was in Washington, D.C. I put all my stuff in storage, I think, on the Saturday, and by Sunday I was on a flight and having dinner at a Jamaican restaurant, I think, in just south of Silver Spring, I think. so, so for me, you were very instrumental in that. And what came later, I'm so grateful that we had met. I think yourself, Angie Gates took the time out to meet with me. And big shout out to Gloria Nodden, who originally connected the dots with an event that she had done at the Eden Hotel. But I felt for the first time that DC hadn't been since, I think, the Million Man March. So it had been a long, long time, and it was beautiful. I mean, I drove down some of the streets, and I felt like I was in parts of downtown Toronto. It was clean, it was gorgeous, it was a different city than I remember those many years ago. And I'm quite sure that's part and parcel to some of the work that you and your colleagues at your office and other affiliated offices have been doing. DC was just amazing when I got there. So I have a question for you. So we're going to take through I want people in this podcast to understand that creativity and design lives more just in the hands of photographers and artists. Yes, we are part of that. But I do believe it's quite possible that you are probably one of the most plugged in people to creativity that I know, because your entire knowledge of what DC has to offer with the multitude of museums that it would take you, I think, a few years to go through if you try to do them all carefully one by one. All of that, the National Mall, all of these things. I want to ask you what you do, but first I want to ask you, how does it feel to be so deeply immersed in so much art, design, creativity in a city that people underestimate? Washington, D.C., I think, is much more stunning than people who have never been there could imagine. So I'm curious how it feels to just be immersed in that.
I appreciate that question. I mean, I moved to DC literally months after 9/11. And I talk about, and I'm sure we'll unplug, we'll do a deeper dive. There are two significant things in my career that really made me think differently about myself and about decisions I've made. Um, 9/11 was one of them. The other, of course, like so many of us, was the year 2020 for a variety of reasons. So I moved here after visiting several times. I'm a kid that was born in Washington State, in a city called Spokane, Washington. Very small black community. Lived in San Jose. Lived in Savannah. Went to high school, Savannah, college in Savannah, Savannah State, HBCU. Lived in Atlanta for 10 years. And as I would travel back and forth, because I've been in this industry for 34 years, I always said, if I stay on the East Coast, Washington, D.C. is one of the cities that I'd love to visit, I mean, to live. And it was for the reasons that you referenced. It was a beautiful city. Um, it's a city that people truly don't understand, especially those that don't visit, because their perception is the person standing in front of a public federal building talking politics. And so therefore the perception of a federal city, DC can't escape it, which is a huge part of what we do in terms of promoting DC as a destination. But I always felt when I came here as a visitor how I felt the power. I felt the synergy walking down the street. And when I moved here after 9/11, I felt a level of responsibility. One, as an economic development organization, it's our goal to bring conventions and tourists to the city, and none of that was happening after 9/11. Very little. Um, and so there was an opportunity to really play a huge role in re, the um, the resurgence, if you will, of the industry after such a tragic thing that happened. But one thing never changed was the energy of Washington as a destination. Um, on the outside looking in, it was through a visitor's lens, the powerful, iconic parts of the city, things in which we've experienced and explored in Washington, D.C. But after moving here, it was a totally different feel. It was the international feel of a city with only 700,000 people, and realizing that D.C. is really defined by the people and the history equally as much as the federal experience. And that is still not lost on me. You know, I live on Capitol Hill. I ride through through the mall every morning. I look to my left, look to my right. I'm looking at the Washington Monument. I'm looking at the Capitol building, and saying I live in one of the most powerful cities in the world. And that really kind of never it always resonates as a positive thing for me as a Washingtonian. Long answer. Sorry for going
Wow.
on so long.
No, no, please. I think the folks need to hear that, and I want to echo that. It's almost embarrassing to say, and if I have the guts, I may throw the photo up in the edit when we put this up. But when I first got to DC, I did a lot of walking. I walked all over the city, at night, in the middle of the night, in the daytime. And one day I walked and I saw this little, you know, man-made pond of water and this massive building behind. And I thought, this is an epic picture for a selfie for the social media. And I put my camera down on the timer and I took this picture and I was standing there and you could see this. I was dressed up, bundled a little warm. I had a scarf on. It was a little chilly, and you could see this joy in my face. I had this smile, this smirk that just spoke how comfortable I was. And you know, it took me a while to realize I was sitting in front of the Capitol. And I said, wow, look at that. The amount of times I've seen this thing on television, this, that, and the third. And here I was in the heart of DC, quiet in the streets, as you know, and sitting in front of this place. And I was just like in awe and enamored. And it spoke to how I felt about DC as a whole from that point forward. I visited every monument along the National Mall like a kid in a candy store. You know, the opportunity to see it with very, very few people and to stand inside of all of them and in front of all of them and immersed in all of them, and to be standing, you know, at Lincoln and looking forward and seeing the Washington Monument in the distance and times of day and when the sun's setting or when it's rising. I mean, it was such a joy in every moment I looked around. It reminded me of like living in Medellin, Colombia, where I was for a short period of time, because it's a valley. And so the mountains on each side, you're just walking down the street and you look down a gap and then you see the long street, and at the end of the street, there's a mountain. Like there was, every time you looked around, there's some incredible visual experience. And I got that. I got that in DC, unlike any other city that I've been in the United States of America. And so I want to ask you about challenges that you face in that space, but particularly how you also dealt with, from a personal standpoint, this two-way trauma that you experienced. You moved after 9/11, and yet we met just before the pandemic. How was being in the Capitol during those two incredible moments? In fact, even the crash of 2006, 2007, when people were thinking, wow, this is kind of the end of world powers as we know it. Everyone's panicked about what's happening economically around the world due to that. What is it like being in the center of the world's most powerful country, in its capital, personally, at that time, in those moments? Are there similarities, common threads, differences? I'm very curious.
Yeah, I think that when I told family and friends that I was moving to Washington, and I told them at the end of September 2001, they, are you crazy? It's not safe. All the things that you hear, because America was not accustomed to that type of terrorism.
Yeah.
Other parts of the world were, and Americans, we watch stuff on TV in other countries, and we say, "Oh, it's terrible," and then we go on about our day. but this was defining for a lot of reasons. So, moving to the city right after that time, being responsible for tourism and conventions and knowing that they weren't coming because people were very concerned about coming to the city. Now, we don't work for the government. I'm a private nonprofit organization, but we work closely with the government. So the challenge was really the perception of safety in Washington, D.C., similar to what happened in Pittsburgh and, of course, New York City, with the same unfortunate tragedy. Then, to your point, it was exacerbated by things that people forget. Then there was the anthrax, not
Wow.
scare, but anthrax that happened at the post office here in the city that killed people. Then after that, it was a sniper. Do you remember the sniper where,
Yes.
uh, it's sad that it happened. But he was called a DC sniper. Everybody was shocked when we found out he was black.
Yep.
but
I remember that.
I remember that, and but only one of the actual shootings happened in D.C., and it literally was like one block in D.C. from Maryland, but it was a D.C. sniper. So we had that. We had five government shutdowns, and lo and behold, what are we dealing with now? A potential another government shutdown. We had, to your point, 2008, the economic crash, um, and then we had 2021, January 6th, so the insurrection. So there have been a lot of things that have happened in the city over the 22 years that I've been here, that have given us all a reason to say, how do we promote DC as safe and fun and friendly after these occurrences have happened? And you have to. I'm a glass half full person. I relied heavily on my friends that run tourism organizations at the time, and most of them, because I've been here for 22 years. I've been CEO for about 15, so I was number two here for the first seven. But I learned a lot from Paris, cities that have unfortunately had to deal with terrorism several times, and other countries that have had to deal with terrorism, and figuring out ways to recover after such a horrific thing that has happened, be it terrorism and or something else. And we've become relatively resilient, to the challenges that we've had to deal with, and we basically have something in, like with the potential looming government shutdown, the perception is DC is closed. Yes, the federal experience for the most part is compromised,
Hmm.
not necessarily all closed right away, but there are other things in the city that people can see and do. But the perception is DC is closed, and so we're not coming. And we've got to deal with that perception, which then becomes our reality and something we have to sell against. So it's all about resilience. It's all about learning from others. Now in this capacity, I'm the person that people come to because we've had to deal with so many situations similar to that.
I mean, your capacity, as you described these other elements that sadly and unfortunately have slipped my memory that they were all tied to DC. Your capacity to step back speaks to me of perseverance. It speaks to me of a passionate understanding of what you're dealing with. So I just want to ask you from a personal standpoint, and actually, I did want to mention one other thing. What you said is really key to me. When I put up the activation in Noma, which was the 150-foot wall painted matte black with the image of my selfie that said nothing to fear but fear itself, and all of the images I'd taken along the National Mall. I put that up with a big giant 25-foot sign that said, "This too shall pass." I think one of the grand blessings of DC, it reminds you of the history of this country. It reminds you of the significance of the events that have taken place, and that at the end of the day, we are still here. At the end of the day, we have another opportunity to be better, another opportunity to be greater, another opportunity to recognize our resilience. And so, from a personal standpoint, how have you managed, I would assume, the demands of trying to bring back a city that's had this many ebbs and flows and bring it back to beauty, bring it back to imagination? I know my experience talking to you, it did it right away. You've got a real lock on how this place how that place runs. And I'm very curious, how has it affected you in terms of stress, in terms of how you've dealt with that stress? What are the things that you see have how you've grown just living through all of that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's kind of funny as I've referenced all those things, I failed to mention 2020, the president that was in office at the time, and of course the pandemic, and those things affected us as well. I think that one thing for sure, as I talk to my industry about being a black person in an industry that doesn't skew diversity at the higher levels of leadership, you learn those things from your ancestors.
Hmm.
You learn perseverance. You learn it through their stories of perseverance. And sometimes, Robert, I sit back and say, my charge is important because what we do brings people to the city, which then creates jobs, which then gives people in Washington the wherewithal to pay their bills, which is extremely important to me. But there are, as a person responsible for tourism, hospitality, there are people that really have had it much harder.
Yeah.
So, as a glass half full person, I'm like, look, I've got a charge, I have a responsibility, but let's just keep it real. When I think about the stories of my grandparents and my great grandparents, I had the pleasure of getting to know. I am so fortunate to be in a place where as I'm responsible for these things. Doesn't mean they don't stress me out because I'm always concerned about housekeeper that's not working, therefore can't pay their bills, and or the loss of life. But I also recognize by staying on track, there is a huge responsibility that is placed on us in terms of how do we get people encouraged to come back to Washington, therefore the economics tied to visitation. And I take that very seriously, and that's always um, my primary way of thinking. But I'm former military too, Robert. So,
Wow.
I spent 6.5 years in the National Guard and Air Force, and you learn how to deal with conflict. You learn how to deal with stressful situations in advance. And so I think there was a large degree of preparedness tied to my upbringing as well as tied to being in the military and and now of course being here as long as I have, it's just the repetitiveness of things that have happened in this city, in this country, that means we have to be prepared to move beyond the circumstances in which we're in.
One of the things I learned in DC, I don't know if I learned it in DC, but I came to lock in the philosophy in DC. And I remember I mentioned it on an interview when I was in Toronto. And it was racism is an antiquated concept. It served a purpose at some great time for a handful of people to make great wealth and to take advantage to a degree of the people of the African diaspora to make their lives a touch easier. But we are so past that period of time, nobody's going back to being enslaved, that it is terribly confusing to me that it stands in the way. And so, powerfully, normally a subject that I would try to find the beauty to talk around instead of talking at. There's a conflict for me that I'm interested to get your perspective on. I am a Canadian born to Jamaican parents. My mother is half Chinese. People look at me in America, I walk around and their number one assumption is that I am an African American. And yet here I am, a dual citizen with a quarter Chinese dual citizen with Jamaican heritage. And so that visualization, I was blessed in a small way to not be weighed down by the history of the African American experience because I grew up in Canada to Jamaican parents. Tell me how your Bahamian background impacted how you saw being a black man in America and at such a high position. As you mentioned, your particular industry at the higher levels is not exactly one known for its great sense of diversity. Not to say it's not a good industry. I think it's a fantastic industry. But explain to me, how do you navigate that? How do you remain cool? And I want to be honest when I say this. The reason I'm asking, because my health and well-being was badly impacted during the pandemic. I had to take, after all of these activations that I did in DC and the things that I had done, and a video I shot in Philadelphia with kids riding bicycles beside police escorts in the middle of what's going on with George Floyd and all the rest, the design of the Black Lives Matter mural on 16th Street, all these things. I had a timeout. I had a moment when I got to Toronto and I was dealing with a normal, everyday type of microaggression discrimination situation that I constantly deal with in Canada. And it really lit me up. I was really angry. I was really, I was out of myself. And I realized, whoa, hold on. What's going on? And unbeknownst to me, with all of my emotional intelligence courses and study of meditation and wellness and how to focus and stay on purpose and even recently taking on equanimity, the thing I realized is that underlying while I was letting these things go by me, these aggressions that I've become accustomed to that I don't let hold me down, it was extra intense during the pandemic. And it was extra intense during what was happening with the racial awakening due to the unfortunate loss of Mr. George Floyd. And so how did you navigate that exactly? I know I keep coming back to this. How did you navigate it? But we talk about military, you talk about calm under pressure. It sounds to me like equanimity. And I'm curious, what is your daily practice to try to maintain that now being out of the military as long as you have been?
You know, Robert, you talked on a lot. You brought up a lot of points,
Mm,
and there's no easy way to answer. So I'll try to dissect my answer in a way where I'm hoping that I'm capturing the things in which you referenced.
mm,
So, go back to, I said that there are two defining moments in my career: 9/11 and 2020. 9/11 simply because I woke up, I was in Atlanta, a city that I loved, and I was thinking about what happened in America, but I was also thinking about the position and the organization that I was with, which I loved as well for 10 years. Great leadership, I have a lot of respect for them, but they saw me as someone who, if this was the pinnacle of success, this was my pinnacle of success, and I should be very grateful for where I was. And it wasn't their fault, and I'm not putting it on them, but I drank the Kool-Aid in thinking that I was as high as I was going to get within that organization, and I should be really grateful.
mm,
It's so Southern, so uniquely different than what I was taught being on the West Coast. 9/11 was just an eye opener for me. Why am I still here? I have more that I could do. I need to leave. And it was kind of codified when I told them a couple of days later that I'm leaving the company. And they're like, well, what do you mean? Things are great. Things are good. And I'm like, well, they're good, but I'm pretty confident that there's more for me. And there's more that I could say, but I'll just leave it there. But it was a good experience. But then I kicked myself because I said I would never allow um, circumstances of others to dictate, or get complacent, something that my parents told me not to do. And I felt like I'd gotten real comfortable and real
mm-hmm,
complacent. So
mm-hmm.
that was my wake up call and time to go. Growing up, we were taught certain things, you know, stay in your space, especially if you had Caribbean grandparents that my great grandfather owned a company in the Miami area, which was unprecedented for a black man in that time. My
Yeah.
my mom's parents are from Georgia, so there was a lot of talk about being black in the South, or being black well, South Floridians don't consider themselves the South, but it's the South,
It's the South.
and it's the South. And there are a lot of lessons that I learned about just going along with things that I've heard in the military. You kind of laugh nervously about things that you know that you shouldn't, that you don't agree with, but you have to because you don't want to stand out and make people feel uncomfortable or be disruptive and what have you. So, you move. I moved to DC, moved, and continued on with life. 2020 was defining in a similar way in terms of racial reckoning, because to your point, you felt a lot of things in 2020. We were all at home in 2020. It wasn't as if these things were happening in America like they traditionally did, and then we went to work and we had distractors. We had no distractors. We sat there, we watched TV. Most of us CNN, MSNBC, a lot of people watched Fox. A lot of us have heard throughout our careers that racism doesn't exist in America, and we were watching all that being challenged by a president that was fueling the flames of racism. Didn't create it, but allowed them to come out. And how sad that the leader of the free world, the most powerful country in the world, was the leader that was uh, uh, fanning those flames of racism.
Yeah.
And I'm right here in Washington D.C. with our mayor creating Black Lives Matter Plaza, with all of the protests that were going on, and also at the same time, I was chair of the U.S. Travel Association,
Wow.
first black person in this organization's history to be the chair, the youngest chair, and an organization that skewed mostly white, mostly male, very conservative, and instead of me riding the wave and being comfortable and being in this space, and you know how we all joke within our community, don't mess it up for the rest of us. Uh, you know, I was
Yeah.
like, I've got to do something. I've got to speak up. I've got to speak my truth about being black in this industry. I've got to make sure that all these people that have seen me and always think that you're different from the rest of your community need to understand how I feel about what's going on, not not allowing them to call, you know, the vandalism that was happening, making that the narrative,
Hmm.
and understanding, getting them to understand that George Floyd's death was just one of several black people that have been killed by police and or by circumstances, and then watching the frustration of America because we're all sitting at home,
Hmm.
and taking that opportunity to make it a part of my narrative within the chairmanship of the U.S. Travel Association and the leader of tourism and hospitality in Chocolate City. Coming back to my team, talking to them about what I felt, things we were not told. Don't ever come to work and tell people how you feel. That's going
Hmm.
to make people feel uncomfortable, especially if it's about racism, because nobody wants to hear that.
Yep.
And for the most part, you were always the minority, and the feedback was you were making people feel uncomfortable. Well, now I'm the chair and I'm the president of this organization, and I felt compelled to be a leader in that space. How I felt personally was very sad and very emotional about it all. And that's exactly what I talked about amongst me with other members of our industry. There are
Mm.
700 destination management organizations. There are 11 of us that are black. The seven males that are in the industry, we all kind of got together and did what we normally do. If you're if you're part of the Latino community, you probably call your Latino friends and you talk about something that is hurting you, because that makes you feel comfortable to talk to people that are like you. This is exactly what we did, but we took it a step further and we did a video that talked about what it's like being black in America and black in this industry. We challenged our industry to be more purposeful in terms of creating jobs at higher levels for black people within tourism and hospitality. Meanwhile, as an individual, I was taking all this in, taking the negative and positive feedback about what we were doing within U.S. Travel Association and moving forward. Because, you know, Robert, I'm 57 years old now. I'm
Hmm.
no longer that young guy. And I'm like, you know, if at this age I'm not comfortable in speaking my truth and empowering other generations to speak their truth earlier, because that's not what we were taught. Remember,
Yeah.
we were
Yep.
taught stay in your space, make people feel comfortable, even if you were just marginalized. You cannot come to work and tell people you were pulled over by the police just for being black. You have to
Hmm.
come and smile and continue to do your job.
Yeah.
So long answer again, but that those are snippets of things that happened and how I felt. My wife and I talked about it. She's a leader in the industry in hospitality as well. She took the same challenge within Kimpton Hotels, where she is the only senior level person of a black person within that space, and really made it a priority as well. One other thing I want to mention that you referenced. We talk a lot about being black in America, But not every black person is American. I never call myself African American. I call myself black. But one of the things I appreciate the most about hospitality and travel gives you a chance to appreciate people's likenesses and understand a little bit more of their differences as well. And in a city like Washington, where you can put 10 black males side by side, and I guarantee you at least four of the 10 will be from other countries other than America. How do we make sure we capture the diversity of America, even for those that look like us but are not from America? And that is exactly the beauty of a city like Washington with 180 plus embassies with people from all over the world that you know nothing about them, and then they open their mouth and you hear their accent and you try to figure it out, and then you learn more about who they are. But when you travel to their countries, which is why I love travel, you learn even more, and they ask you more questions about you.
Yeah.
If I'm in Asia, if I'm in China, there are not a lot of black people that were in China 20 years ago. You see more and more, but if you go into the smaller towns, you don't. I always position myself in a way where they can ask me questions about being black in America.
Yeah.
Uh, and because it's important that I'm giving them some sense of, of who I am as an individual versus what they normally get, which is through a movie or a TV show.
When you're eloquent in how you describe it, it really aligns with my perspective. I think in this moment, I'd like to speak to the brothers that are watching. And this, of course, this podcast is for everyone. I'm a humanist. It's for all human beings. I believe the more we know about each other, the more the world is a greater place as a whole. In this space, in this moment, I'd like to speak to the brothers. So you look at myself and you look at Elliott, I think it's likely our experiences mirror each other in that in many, many occasions, we are the only black person in the room. And the big rooms, big decisions being made, we're the only black people in the room. And I want to speak to confidence. I want to speak to what it is to function in the world and connect those dots. And there's a key thing that's important here. I have a philosophy that our differences or our language is key to everything. So because human beings like to live in a space of comfort, it is logical that we gravitate to being in and around people that will understand us. This is the great error in the manner in which human beings think about the concepts of how racism could come to be, how discrimination could come to be. Most of it has to do with common ground. You speak with an accent, I speak with an accent. We're both speaking patois, or we're both speaking French, or we're both speaking English. I walk into a room and there's a bunch of people there, and I'm a Jamaican guy and there's one Jamaican guy in the room. It's likely we're going to connect, but not because of some other skin color. He'll understand me culturally. But here's the key. We grow in distress. You go to the gym, you work out, you lift weights, you put your muscles under distress, and they grow, right? You want to change your dietary system, your body is not functioning with food well, then you take a fast. And in that moment, you struggle, but the body reconfigures itself and we grow. So the concept I say to all human beings watching, the idea of getting to know each other, even though it's a little bit more uncomfortable than what you're accustomed to, causes growth, exponential growth in the manner of which you function in the world. And that's the beauty of travel. I'll never forget going to England when I was a kid. I lost my mind. I had assumed that my life was this neighborhood. This was it, my peripheral. This is what my life was, what my life would be, what I would grow up within. And then I began to travel and I saw what an exponentially special place this world is and so much common ground amongst us. And then the differences really excited me. To that point, I want to ask you on a happier, pleasant, but important point, what are you really excited about? You mentioned I'm 57 now. You're now looking at a government shutdown ahead, another challenge coming once again. to remove the illusions that DC will be closed when it's really just going to be open. What is the next big project you're currently working on or will be working on that you're really excited about in terms of its impact?
Yeah, I think that, I will tell you, I smiled when you said you went to England. I'll never forget the first time I traveled internationally on my own, because most of our travel was to, as I talk to mainstream white America about the black experience, and like the vacation for most black people growing up was going to visit your family members or being dropped off at your family members or something very limited in dynamics. Still impactful, but it wasn't. We didn't go on junkets to global destinations. Fortunately, I grew up in a household where my dad. We had a motorhome on the West Coast, and we would travel, and that's kind of ironically where the bug came for me. But it was mostly domestic. First time I traveled internationally on my own outside of the military, and someone said, "I love your accent." And I stopped and I'm like, what accent? I don't have an accent. You have an accent. I guarantee you, most Americans, because we're a country where there's fewer American, more today than before, but a small percentage of America, probably less than 50%, actually have passports.
Wow.
So therefore, they never leave the country. That's unheard of in places like Jamaica or Europe because you ride down the street, you're in a different country. But it's fascinating because when I'm speaking over there, we always joke about certain accents exude intellect.
Yes.
Like you hear a British accent or you hear a French accent, and you automatically think that person is smart. And so I asked that question. So what do you think about when you hear a black person that that has a degree of eloquence, or as we've heard so many times, speaks well,
Speaks so well.
and we're in your country? Because I'm curious. That's again, travel gives me the chance to really ask those hard hitting questions and to really learn a lot more about myself and also other people and to educate them on me. I know I'm off track, but
No, no, it's
one other
perfect.
thing about I remember traveling to England right after number 45 was elected. Got off the plane. We all sat. First time we've landed 6:37 in the morning, and the pilot told us who was the new president of the United States. And first time I saw a bunch of men who just didn't immediately get up to go nowhere because we can't get off the plane for the next 20 minutes anyway. Everybody just kind of sat back. And I was on a panel in 2 days to talk about how to deal with crisis. We started off on talking about crisis. How does DC rebound after crisis? And I was on a panel with global tourism leaders, usually called ministers, Minister of Tourism in Jamaica, Minister of
Yes.
Tourism in Greece. And we were all talking about, be it, tsunamis or, things that happen in our countries and how we rebounded. And I showed up at this event, and there were about 12 name tags still left. And there's this older white woman that was there with about 3 or 4 black females. Arguably, if you're in London, they're either from Jamaica or from Africa.
Yep.
And they smiled at me. I smiled at them, still thinking about the dynamics of the politics of America. And the woman looked at me, the older white woman, and said, "Can I help you?" And I'm like, I hate that when I'm in a restaurant, instead of them asking me, "Would you like a table?" they ask me, "Can I help you?" I'm like, "I don't know, can you?" That was my first reaction. I don't know, can you? And she says, "Well, what are you here for?" I said, "Well, what's going on?" And she says, "Well, this is a blah." She told me what the conference was, which I knew, but I was just kind of like, is this woman challenging me after, I'm still mad at America for the president. Uh, and so then she says, "Well, we don't have your name tag." And I said, "Well, what is my name?" And she says, "Well, sir, I don't think we have your name tag." And I didn't, and I had already, we do this enough. We know where our name is. And I just picked up my name tag without looking at it and putting it on. I said, "Well, why did you not think this was my name?" And then she became flustered, and
Yep.
she and she probably was 60 or 70 years old. My name's Elliott Ferguson. It's either Irish or Scottish, or in some cases, the name Elliott is very Jewish. And so I put my name tag on, and the black girls were just really intrigued into this conversation. I said, "So you just automatically assumed that my name wasn't here? What made you think that?" and it just totally changed my attitude. I mean, it went from grumpy to worse because now, even in this country, I'm dealing with this crap,
Yes.
whereas I have to justify who I am and tell her that I'm here. I was the speaker at the freaking conference. So, of course, I get up there and I start talking about, the first thing the moderator asked me was about the dynamics of the new president of America. They had just gone through Brexit. I said, "You don't talk about Brexit, I won't talk about American politics." But then I kind of touched on that experience, whereas that was before 2020. If it was after 2020, I probably would have been more engaging, not in a confrontational way, but in a way to get her to understand that you can't, the American experience is so different in terms of our names, in terms of the slave trade, et cetera, et cetera. But it just annoyed me that once again, she could not automatically assume, she'd never assumed that I was there for that conference. And yes, I was the only black person in the room, which I was very, very familiar with. So, I think that stands out, and that's been part of the conversation within tourism in terms of understanding the dynamics and diversity of our community, as well as getting people to understand the dynamics of the Black experience in America. I can't tell you the number of times I've had to go, I was in other countries, and I had to explain to them about slavery
Yeah.
because they heard of it, but they did not understand it.
Yeah.
And even in America that exists, but you then become the person to get them to understand the unsurmountable odds of the black experience in America and in Caribbean countries, and the fact that we were able to survive so much, our ancestors, our grandparents, and what have you, and yet we're still here and we're still moving in positive directions, which is exactly the goal for me at age almost 58, in educating the younger community behind me you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait your turn. You don't have to stay in a job and feel marginalized, and get them to understand my experiences so that they can learn and do better, if you will. I think you asked me a question a long time ago. I never answered it. And I forgot what it was, Robert.
It
I'm
was
sorry.
it was what I prefer what you said. This is flow. Someone needs to hear what you just said. I am not doing this textbook. This is spirit. And so I trust
Good.
that someone needed to hear what you just said. My question that I had that was my textbook important question was your current passion project. What's on the table for you that you're really excited about that's coming down the pike currently?
Couple things. One, my day job, which is tied to, how do we just got additional funding. Our budget went from roughly $30 million to almost $50 million to promote our destination.
Amazing.
Sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but other cities and other countries have larger budgets, and then they have states that also have tourism organizations. So I'm excited because this gives me the wherewithal to do more in terms of promoting the diversity of DC. Yes, I love the federal experience, monuments, memorials, museums. But as you experienced, you lived in a neighborhood that didn't exist when I moved to DC. There are other parts of the city that are amazing. There's a lot of cultural history here, the architecture, things like that. I now have a chance to do more marketing above and beyond what I did before because I have the finances to do it. I'm extremely excited about that. My passion projects within the industry would be our foundation, the American Experience Foundation, and I'm an executive on loan to the Marriott Sorensen Center, Hospitality Center at Howard University,
Hmm.
engaging and encouraging students in all different schools at Howard to get interested in hospitality. Most people think you work in a hotel, you work in a restaurant, which there's nothing wrong with either, but they don't think about being the architect of the restaurant or the owner of the hotel or the person in accounting or engineering, all these different career tracks that exist within hospitality that are far higher paying than the lower level, but equally as impactful in terms of your career goals. And that's tied to making sure that when I leave this industry, there will be more people that look like us that are in higher places, and that ties to getting kids interested in hospitality. Our foundation, the American Experience Foundation, is tied to understanding the dynamics of poverty. You know, we had a group of kids through the foundation that we flew here from Puerto Rico. I'll be in Puerto Rico next week for International Gay Lesbian Travel Association as I'm a speaker. These kids came to DC after the hurricane, a couple years afterwards, because the foundation brings them here to showcase, travel outside of their community.
Hmm.
And a couple of them told us that they'd never seen the ocean, and they live in Puerto Rico.
Say what?
And so, what that says to you is that poverty basically limits your opportunity to truly learn more about even the city that you live.
Yeah.
You know, there are kids in Washington, D.C. that live in parts of the city that have never left their neighborhoods because of poverty. So the foundation, we do field trips, whereas we'll take a group of kids from DC, even if we bring them to a hotel in downtown Washington and take them around the city, it expands their horizons. If we take them on a bus and we take them to New York City, and they've never been to New York, and they get a behind the scenes tour of the Marriott Marquis or a theater, they do all these amazing things. It expands their horizons and has them thinking beyond just their community that they're in. The foundation also creates scholarships. We work with hospitality schools within the high schools to give them internships, apprenticeships, and then if they could choose to go into hospitality into college, then we offer scholarships and apprenticeships to come back and work here at Destination DC or C or somewhere else. So my passion is tied to getting one getting kids to think above and beyond their current circumstances, which is extremely important, and then two, engaging Black and Brown youth in our industry to get them interested in taking on positions and or ownership within the industry.
So, when this is all done, we have lots to talk about. So, living in DC has definitely lit up my brain in terms of, my thing I love to do is show up somewhere and show people their own place like they've never seen it before. And so I'm very excited of what you just described in terms of the efforts that your office is making and that the funding has come in. Because I remember we crossed paths right when all the funding was shrinking due to the fact that no one was traveling. And that was like, I don't know how you managed to keep afloat, and somehow you did. My thoughts are kids, adults, anyone, they're sitting down right now watching. They see this distinguished gentleman and the incredible work that he's doing, and they're like, "Man, I never thought about a career in that." Hospitality. Maybe they're only thinking about, nothing wrong with a hard day's, good day's work, But maybe they're thinking hospitality. You mean cleaning rooms? Like, well, what are we talking about? And now they've heard from your description this incredible opportunity. They've heard about travel. They've heard about speaking in front of large audiences all over the world, and maybe a kid sitting here right now, he's super excited. Like, this is crazy. If he's got his notebook out and a pencil or a pen, can you give him a series of steps as how he can get from where he is to where you are someday?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I remind people all the time what we do is not rocket science. It is, all about building relationships. It's all about strong communication skills. If you don't have them, understand you don't have them, and surround yourself with people that can help you with those skills. None of us, we were, as the quote goes, we're all born with talent, but not all of us have the opportunity that exists in other communities.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you learn more about an industry? I would venture to say that the kid that I was in 1989 when someone came to me and said, "Hey, I want you to consider working for the Savannah Convention and Visitors Bureau,"
Hmm.
is as ignorant as the kid in 2023 when you say, "Hey, I want you to go work in hospitality." Because my first reaction was, I just finished college. I'm not doing bus tours or working at a hotel or restaurant. I'm insulted. You know, no idea as to how vast this industry is,
Yeah.
and the irony, tied to. And there's a fun story. If we have time, I'll share with you about. Um, I've shared it before about my interest in cities and travel, but it really tied into the inner core of who I was as a person. I knew I wanted to get a degree in business
Hmm.
and marketing, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. And who knew that there was a career field tied to hospitality that allowed me to travel domestically and internationally, that allowed me to build relationships that are long lasting in a career that I absolutely love. And so I'd say to those kids, the thing you have today that I don't have is everybody has a phone. Look up Convention and Visitors Bureau, look up Destination DC, go to LinkedIn, look me up, ask questions, look up, if you're in a different city, which most of you probably are, see if your city has a Convention and Visitors Bureau. Every city probably does. It's usually, our name used to be Washington Convention and Visitors Bureau. Now it's Destination DC. Um, as you said, Robert, if you reach out to me, more than likely I'm going to follow up with
Yeah.
you. And I can't say that everyone's going to have the same experience, but if you with other people, but if you reach out to me, I will follow up and I will give you some additional insight as to what this career field is all about because it is extremely rewarding. Even in my personal life, I met my wife through this industry,
Wow.
and she travels quite often. So we understand the dynamics of tourism and the power of travel, the power of conventions. We're about to host um, a World Cultural event in Washington D.C. The last time it was held was a few years back in India. It attracted 4 million people.
Wow.
So, we're all nervous about this government shutdown because it's on the National Mall. But, it's right now they've got 300,000 plus people coming to Washington, D.C., World Cultural Fest. We helped make sure that that happened in the city. People will be working, but equally as much, the dynamics of the global community coming to Washington, us learning from them. It's all about the power of prayer, yoga, spiritual healing, and what have you. It's just an amazing experience that's going to be right here in the nation's capital. At the same time, Greenbuild, which is a convention going on at the convention center, is all tied to, how our companies or construction companies focusing on building buildings that are environmentally safe and focusing on the saving our planet. So it's just kind of cool to be in an industry whereas all the things I referenced before, plus these unique experiences exist that I have a chance to be a part of.
Legacy. Legacy. Okay, so an important question. It's a little left to center. I have never done it on the podcast, and it's not part of my my normal route of questions. But I did it once, and I did it during the Unmasked Fear campaign that was born in D.C., but I eventually did in Toronto. I asked the question of 12 people. I believe it was the largest activation of black portraits in the history of Canada at the Harbourfront Centre. And those portraits were matched by individual uncut interviews. Ironically, I think I was setting myself up to do the podcast, didn't even know it yet. One of the key questions I asked people at the end, which is not the end for us yet, but I wanted to say this while we had it because I'm thinking about the level of the legacy of the work that you're doing and the impact that it's having. 40 years from now, your kids are watching a video of grandpa. What would you say to them?
Um, I guess the question, well, would it be my nieces and nephews since we have no kids?
Okay.
But um, I think I would hope that they look at whatever I did 40 years earlier and subsequent years and ask me questions about um, living in America, traveling the world, and this industry. And I would tell them that, we live, despite the issues that we have in this country, we live in one of the best countries and the greatest countries in the world. Despite racism and sexism and all the things in which we have to deal with, which other parts of the world deal with, um, we live in a democracy. And I've been positioned in my small space to have a voice tied to leaving the industry that I love better than when I entered it.
Wow.
And that is my goal now. And I hope that that is what they see when they think about, they're looking at pictures of old guys 40 years from now.
Well, inspired by that, you mentioned something that I wanted you to go back to. The story that you
Sure.
said you've told before about you and travel in cities.
Yeah, my parents hate when I tell this story, but this will resonate with you because you have Caribbean parents.
Yep.
So I was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked me what sparked my interest in travel. And I said, well, I've always had a vivid imagination because I was always under punishment as a kid. And the interviewer asked me, what do you mean? I said, well, you have to live in a Southern/Caribbean household to understand the dynamics of a punishment back then. I'm like, for me, if I did something wrong, which I was always doing something wrong, I was an internal criminal. Outside, people thought I was a great kid, but inside, I, borrow my mom's quarters or take something I have no business taking, and I would be sent to my room for 3 weeks, maybe 6 weeks,
Wow.
and that shock value of that was one thing. But what was in my room, because they took the TV out, was a globe and encyclopedias. So out of sheer boredness, I would spin the globe, wherever the globe would land, in my finger on it. I would open the encyclopedia and do a book report and think about living or being in that country.
What?
And the irony of me being in this industry, and that became, when I'm older, these are the countries I want to visit, because I remember doing this story on Korea or doing this story on different parts of the world. And, then my mom called because she heard about it. She apologized. She says, I'm so embarrassed. And in my office now, I've got 12 globes because people laughed and said that was one of the coolest stories ever. But that was ironically how that ties into what I do professionally today in terms of my interest in travel, was because of being under punishment and having an encyclopedias and a globe in my room is my entertainment.
There's a
Crazy,
there,
right?
there's a gift you are long overdue. I'm going to there's only two people in DC that have it. One of them is with the mayor. But this was, if you recall, the first time Young World Faces was actually done as a city. And I'm going to call my master printer when we get off of this. I'm going to ask him to print a very large, beautiful, fine art print of the piece, have him ship it to me here in LA. I'm going to sign it and then send it on its way to you, my friend. This is long deserving. And you are a very powerful and yet kind-hearted and open individual, and you are to be uplifted and celebrated for the person that you are, the way that you show up in the world, especially under the challenges that people of the African diaspora have experienced in the United States of America. You are a gentleman and a scholar, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have known you, met you, and to have been able to be part of your lifetime legacy by having you as part of the podcast. Before we go away, I want to ask something in terms of health and wellness. What is your practice, if any, in the morning or in the afternoon? How is it that you take care of your mind and your body?
You mentioned stress earlier. I could not survive without being in the gym or just working out. During the pandemic when the gyms closed, I actually did. My team is like, we can't work out. What are we going to do? I'm like, I'll do a class online, and it blossomed to a couple. It could be 50 people. Because that was my way of dealing with stress. If you, I don't know if you know this, but I am a cancer survivor. I just finished radiation therapy for prostate cancer,
Wow.
and so my team knows because that has its ups and downs. And though I'm done with the radiation, I will have ups and downs in that regard for a while. And so now, as I'm rebounding from that, focusing on getting back on track, also educating black men in general, because we're awful about going to the doctor,
Yeah.
the importance of knowing your PSA, the importance of understanding the dynamics of your body, even if you do all the right things. Because I got that a lot. But you work out and you eat well, and I'm like, yeah, those are all great, but your body can still still have to know your body. So working out, eating well, trying to get enough sleep are the keys, in my opinion, to kind of like getting through some of the stressful times.
Do you meditate?
I do not as much as I should, but I do meditate, and I have friends that are in yoga, and that's something that I want to focus on as I look at continuously being healthy, getting older, and staying active.
Yeah. Well, allow me, if I may, I'd like to offer you a gift right here as before it's and again, this podcast is about creativity and wellness, and so the gift I would like to offer you is not only to take on meditation, even if it's only for 4 minutes every morning to start your morning, but I would look at the practice of visualization. I would look at the nuances tied to what does a fully healthy mind and body that has all of the tools to both fight and recover from cancer look like. Envision that. In fact, all the incredible, when I Google search you, you guys need to go online. In case you have no style, this is a man you need to go check out. He's come very, very modest today in his beautiful cashmere V-neck sweater, but let me tell you, this man has some suits, eh? So I would say to you, visualize that person on the entirely other side of this, having survived it 20, 30, 40 years down the line, well, strong, physically empowered, there is a nuance that happens in the brain that is chemical release of certain endorphins that create healing and move to areas for which could resolve the scenario even beyond our knowing it. And it's not placebo, it's not magic hocus pocus, it's true science in terms of how the brain works. And that visualization, I hope, will give you a gift. It's not something you need to do for endless lengths of time, and even if it's only 1 minute, and start to curate what exactly that story looks like and see yourself in that space. And if you're willing to do that, I'm very curious to hear how you feel in about 6 months from now and how it impacts. One of the things that's great about when you do good stuff, you really don't know how to judge it because you just bad stuff doesn't happen. So you're like, you don't know, oh, am I doing better? But this you will feel. You will feel very powerfully because I know the other things you're already doing right. Now, if you're doing everything else wrong, you're not getting enough sleep, you're not eating, you're not going to the gym, you're not taking your medications, you're doing everything else wrong, this won't do anything for you. But the fact that I know you're a very disciplined person and you're likely doing all of the right things, I think this little added scenario that wouldn't take you more than 5 minutes, 4 minutes of meditation, 1 minute of this visualization each morning as your first thing that you do before picking up a cell phone or checking an email or anything else. Give your brain an opportunity to love itself, your body an opportunity to love itself. And I pray, God, that impacts how you go through the day and move through the day. On the days where you're feeling exhausted maybe sometimes or not feeling your best self, that it'll give you a little bit more energy. So before we go, is there one more thing you would like to say to the audience that I haven't asked you, or just a thought on your mind that we might have conjured up that you would like to share for the people that are watching today?
The only thing I can think of is never be too old, grown up, or smart to unlearn things. Never never think that you can't learn from younger people, and younger people in the right tone. Make sure that you are positioned and work in an environment where your voice is important, because that's not how we were raised professionally. Was wait your turn, no matter if even if you know the boss is driving off a cliff, you say nothing because the boss is always right. Well, that's absolutely absurd. So, you know, I think that sometimes, you hear it in church a lot. The more education a person gets, the less inclined they are to be believers.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter what, you need a belief in something.
Yeah.
You need to meditate. I have good friends. To your point, I appreciate you bringing that up because I need to do more. Need to meditate more. I need to do more yoga. You get older, we tend to think that we can lift what we lifted when we were younger. And even if we can, it's not good for us. So
Yeah.
listen to your body, listen to, and learn different things. And equally as important, never stay in a situation. Whereas if you don't get up every day and say, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get my day started and do this job or whatever it is, then you shouldn't do it.
Wow.
I know that there are people that have to work and they don't have choices. We are now in a period in our lives where things aren't perfect, but we have more choices than ever before. And entering the workplace or being in a job for 15 years, I see that a lot in DC. With government workers, they've checked out, but they've got 6 years to go before their pension, and they're still in it. But I'm like, but you're not happy, So make sure you understand the juxtaposition of being healthy, because happiness, inner happiness, is extremely important. The last thing I'll say that escapes the Black community is self-awareness through counseling. Couples counseling is great, but make sure you have someone that you can go and talk to about who you are as a person. Uncover those things that probably affect and plague you, that were in your childhood, that you kind of you know buried deep down inside, because they'll affect you as an individual today, professionally and personally. So that self-awareness through counseling is extremely important. Growing up Black in America is, no matter what the circumstances, is not always the easiest. I have friends that grew up in Beverly Hills, and their parents tell their kids, remember, you're still Black. And they don't know what that means until they're put in a position where they then realize what
Hmm.
that means. And that really affects you. You have to have an outlet to talk to someone about that. So, I would just want to end on understanding your body, taking care of yourself, but equally as much your spiritual and mental health.
On that note, I usually always, maybe someday I'll do these in the beginning and in the middle, but this podcast is brought to you by a few very interesting organizations I'd like to quickly mention, especially with Elliott's for recent comment about wellness and mental health. BetterHelp is a sponsor of this podcast. And if you look into the captions, you will find that there's a link tied to my name, a vanity link that allows you to log on to their platform and get 10% off if you sign up with them. Sedgless Consulting, which is based out of Virginia, the CEO is right there in Washington, D.C., is also a supporter and sponsor of the podcast. More and more continue to grow, more and more things continue to happen. We want to have more and more of these conversations. So we know the regular talk, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and more importantly, even if you don't do any of that, share. If there's something you found here that touches your heart and you know someone needs it, share it with them, because this is why this work is here. This is why we are here. This is Robert Young's Bright, Famed, Shining, the podcast where creativity meets wellness, and you have been listening to the magnificent Elliott Ferguson. Thank you very much for being here, brother.
Thank you so much, Robert. Keep doing what you're doing. Very proud of you.
Thank you, sir. Ashe.